אנחנו מכריזים בזאת
I'm Barry Shaw, Senior Associate at the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, and this is The View from Israel. I'll be holding a series of important interviews with key individuals, both from Israel and abroad, who have been intimately involved in the charges being made against us by the International Criminal Court, who are accusing Israel and the IDF of various war crimes. And today, my special guest is Maurice Hirsch. Maurice is an international law expert who specializes in the prosecution of terrorists, Palestinian Authority, and also the application of international law as it applies to Judea and Samaria. Maurice served in the IDF Military Advocates General Corps, and he was assistant to the legal advisor to Judea and Samaria. And he was head of legal advice to the Navy, Air Force, Ground Forces, and Home Front, and ultimately head of the military prosecution for Judea and Samaria. And Maurice retired from the IDF after 19 years of service with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Maurice, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Barry. Thank you for having me.
It seems to me, Maurice, that Israel is unique in one aspect, in that its armed forces has to go into battle with an army of lawyers. How did that come about?
Well, so I'm not sure that it's necessarily right to define the army going, the idea of going to war with a group of lawyers. I think it really is a function of the different claims that have been made against Israel for breaching the very, very clear laws of war, and nonetheless the claims have been made. And considering those claims, the army has made, the IDF has made the decision to integrate lawyers within the process of the lawfare, and within the process of fighting a war. Army lawyers are part of that process as well, advising the forces on how to act properly in accordance with laws of war.
Let's talk about the International Criminal Court, and in particular the role taken by the Special Prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda. Would I be right in saying she has a special fascination for Israel?
So yes, Barry, I would say that Fatou Bensouda has been obsessed, not fascinated, but obsessed with Israel. It started with her obsession with Israel regarding the maritime incident in May 2010, the Marmara incident, where she only half-heartedly decided not to investigate the incident or open an investigation into the incident. Let's just describe the incident. Israel imposed a maritime blockade on the Gaza Strip as provided by international law in order to prevent arms getting to the terrorist group Hamas. A group of terrorists on a ship that they commissioned out of Turkey joined an attempt to breach that blockade, and Israel was required to prevent any breach of the blockade as international law prescribes. No less than a special committee of the UN Secretary General declared that Israel's imposition of the blockade was legal, not illegal, it was legal, and that Israel was fully entitled and even required as part of the blockade to enforce the blockade. Nonetheless, given those circumstances, Fatou Bensouda only half-heartedly decided to try and close the investigation, stating that it wasn't sufficiently severe enough. Obviously, you can't make light of the loss of any lives, but we're not talking about an event in which hundreds of people were killed, intentionally targeted by the IDF, civilians along the way, but rather we're talking about terrorists who attacked the IDF soldiers who were trying to enforce a legal blockade. So it started with that, and it's continued all the way through the process, with Bensouda now announcing her intention to investigate Israel for on three different subjects. The first being Operation Protective Edge. What is Operation Protective Edge? Just for 2 seconds. In June 2014, Hamas terrorists in Judea and Samaria kidnapped 3 Israeli teenagers. They murdered them immediately. Israel did not know that. Whilst Israel was looking for the teenagers, hoping to find them alive, the Hamas counterparts in the Gaza Strip decided that they would support their other terrorists, and they started firing rockets at Israel's civilian population, indiscriminately targeting civilians, which is, of course, rarely a war crime. Israel defended itself against these attacks, and now Bensouda is trying to imply that Israel committed war crimes as part of its self-defense against the homicidal attacks of a terrorist organization. Absolutely outrageous. The second subject that she's trying to investigate is what she claims to be the March of Return. What is the March of Return? Hamas terrorists in the Gaza Strip initiated an attempt to cross over the border from Gaza into Israel in order to attack Israeli civilians and Israeli soldiers on sovereign Israeli territory. They decided to frame those attacks in the context of realizing the right of the Palestinian refugees ostensibly to return to their homes, but really only using the civilians as cover for their military operations. That too, Bensouda has decided to investigate. She ignored, for example, what we at PMW, at Palestinian Media Watch, exposed that there was a Facebook group for the organizers. On their Facebook group, they even gave instructions to the participants in these attempted infiltrations where to hide their weapons, when to take out their weapons, not to take them out too early, but only to reveal them, excuse me, once they were at the close proximity of Israeli civilians or soldiers, so that they could kidnap them or kill them. These are clear instructions given by the organizers of these so-called demonstrations to the Hamas terrorists. That she's also trying to investigate. The third subject that she's investigating is the Israeli settlements. Now, what are we talking about, the Israeli settlements? In the entire period from biblical history through to 1948 almost, Jews lived in an area called Judea and Samaria, what the Jordanians would then call the West Bank. Jews, for example, had lived in the city of Hebron for thousands of years. The main synagogue in the Jewish area of Hebron was built in 1540 under the Ottoman Empire. Really 3,000 years of Jewish history in Hebron. The Jewish history in Hebron was cut off only when the Arabs in Hebron in 1929 massacred 67 people, and when the Jordanians in 1948, when they illegally occupied Judea and Samaria, then ethnically cleansed the last of the remaining Jews. When Israel returned to these areas in 1967, Jews sought to return to the land on which they had lived, which they had owned, and to build their homes again. This, according to Fatou Bensouda, is also a war crime. She's relying on provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which have never been applied in any other circumstance. Whilst there are similar places where, or similar examples of where they could have been applied, she is applying those provisions for the first time ever only to Israel. That I wouldn't say is a fascination. That I would say is an obsession with blackening Israel's name and implying that Israel has committed war crimes when really Israel is merely trying to defend itself and is returning to its national homeland as provided by the international community.
Maurice, why do I feel there's a symbiotic relationship between certain committees of the United Nations and the criminal court? I'm thinking of a couple of things here. I'm thinking, for instance, of Article 7 of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, that applies only to Israel. They have to meet once a month and spell out possible crimes and deviations of Israel. That applies Article 7. There's no Article 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, whatever, to other deviant countries, only one that applies to Israel. And also, maybe before your time, Maurice, but I go back also to the a previous investigation of Israel for war crimes read by Richard Goldstone. So I find some symbiotic relationship between United Nations and both the Richard Goldstone inquiry into Israeli war crimes, and today with the Fatah Sud, there's also the current war crimes investigations, which I think emanated out of things that have been raised at the United Nations. Take it from there.
You are without question right, Barry. There is clearly a symbiotic relationship. Much of the claims being made and allegations being made by Fatou Bensouda are claims that have been made by all types of NGOs, submitted to the UN in its different capacities, whether it be OCHA, whether it be to the Human Rights Council, then whitewashed by these biased bodies, and then have been recycled to almost form the basis of the assumption and the allegation that Israel has committed war crimes. Having been a prosecutor for many years, as you described in the opening comments, I have to say, Barry, that this is probably one of the biggest travesties of Fatou Bensouda. Instead of relying on concrete evidence, she is relying and has been relying on secondary and tertiary hearsay evidence, which has no justification whatsoever or no background and basis in real facts, taking events out of their context and then implying that Israel has committed some type of an offense. For example, the incidents that Bensouda is talking about within the context of Protective Edge are incidents in which civilians were killed. Now, you have to understand what the war crime is as opposed to what Bensouda is relying on. The war crime is that someone intentionally targeted civilians with no military bonus or advantage or objective being received, and specifically only set out to target civilians. That's what she's trying to claim. She's basing this argument on reports submitted, again, to the Human Rights Council, to other UN bodies, by these NGOs. Sometimes the NGOs are funded by the UN, who then receive back the same reports that they really have paid for, whitewash those reports, and then pass them on. And there we see claims that, well, some Palestinian was killed. He was ostensibly a civilian, and therefore it is clear that Israel targeted civilians. Well, that's just simply not true. It isn't even the basis for a reasonable decision of the commission or an alleged commission of a war crime, because what happens in war, especially when you're talking about the Gaza Strip and the terrorists that operate there, terrorists operating within the civilian context, hiding missile launchers in buildings themselves, in civilian buildings, using the civilians in general, on whole and en masse, as really as human shields, and then shooting missiles indiscriminately at Israel. When Israel responds, Israel is attacking the military target. Now, in some cases, there will be civilians that are killed, and everyone then links it to this idea of this vague idea, the principle of proportionality. Well, look at what happened in proportionality. If in Gaza 300 civilians were killed, but in Israel no civilians were killed, so obviously there's no the Israeli attacks were disproportionate. That is not the principle of proportionality according to international law. The principle of proportionality by international law says that you cannot attack a military objective if it's seen to be caused excessive incidental loss of human life, and that incidental loss of life is excessive in relation to the military objective that is to be anticipated. In other words, in order to base anything on proportionality, you have to first get into the head of maybe the F-16 pilot who shot the missile, saying, well, what did he see as the military objective that would be achieved when he was pushing the button and attacking that target? If you see, for example, a massive missile launcher in close proximity to 3 civilians, but there are hundreds of rockets being fired out of that missile launcher, obviously the military advantage to be achieved by attacking that missile launcher is huge, and the civilian life that may or may not be lost, or the injury that may be caused to civilians, is only entirely incidental to attacking the military target. Now, Bensouda has no proof whatsoever that Israel intentionally attacked civilian targets. But when the NGOs and the UN try to distort the idea and the equation of proportionality, she accepts the argument that every civilian life is a priori a war crime. Now, this has exceptional ramifications, not only for Israel, but for every country in the world fighting terrorism. Every country in the world that fights in a situation where terrorists hide themselves in civilian populations, using that civilian population as human shields, and those really the liberal democratic countries fighting for their own freedom, just defending themselves, are likely to find themselves as suspects of committing war crimes. Unless, of course, Fatou Bensouda can say that, well, and this is really what she's saying. She's saying that we don't necessarily ignore entirely the laws of war, but we're going to attribute to Israel a standard that we don't attribute to anyone else as part of our obsession and our demand to blacken the name of Israel. That's her investigation. Let there be no misunderstandings, no misgivings about it. And it's done, again, as you asked in the question, through the NGO mechanisms that report to the UN bodies, having been funded by those same UN bodies, and then whitewashed by those committees. And you really, it is the height of unprofessionality. A prosecutor needs to rely on real facts. He cannot rely on secondary and tertiary hearsay facts as a basis for opening an investigation. And that is exactly what Bensouda has done.
Yes, you made some references about what she's doing to Israel would apply to other armies as well. And I'll be interviewing also Colonel Richard Kemp, Commander of British Forces, who has very firm views on this as well to support what you just said. But part of the targeting or part of the facilities that were being operated in Gaza by Palestinian Hamas were out of civilian homes and civilian facilities, but also, and this is why I come on to the United Nations connection, out of United Nations schools, for instance, the UNRWA schools, that was a weapon storage place, and they were firing also missiles and rockets into Israel and firing on IDF forces from within a United Nations facility, and perhaps even worse than that, they had their command and control center in the Wafa hospital in Gaza City, where in the basement was converted for their Hamas control center, and also the place that the Palestinian Hamas leaders fled to for protection. And they launched also rockets from outside of the hospital and fired on IDF soldiers from the windows of the hospital. Are these war crimes, Maurice? War crimes committed by the other side, not by IDF.
Hamas and the terrorists from Hamas have tremendous legal advice. They have this whole band of NGOs that are supporting them, that are advising them, funded by the UN, that are advising Hamas on the laws of war. They know exactly which objectives would enjoy some type of protection against attack, and they specifically use and abuse those objectives in order to make and carry out their attacks on Israel's civilian populations, exactly as you described it. The Shifa hospital in Gaza turned into a command center for Hamas. Hospitals are in general immune from attack. But when the person who is enjoying that immunity abuses the immunity in order to turn those buildings, which would necessarily or would in general enjoy some type of protection, when they abuse that protection in order to carry out war crimes, those buildings lose their protection. We're talking about hospitals, we're talking about UN facilities, we're talking about mosques, all of these which were used to store weapons, to fire really missiles at Israel, and to attack Israeli soldiers and civilians, in the clear knowledge that if Israel were to hit any of these targets, then they would be able to use those attacks as an additional way to delegitimize Israel. These are clear war crimes, not only the firing of indiscriminate missiles at Israel's civilian population, but also the use and abuse of protected targets for the purpose of carrying out those very same attacks that breach the laws of war.
The Operation Protective Edge wasn't a unique standalone incident. It was simply a continuation of decades of Palestinian terror, both instigated by Ramallah and also instigated by Gaza. And I'm thinking here of a previous operation, Operation Cast Lead, which again took place because Hamas was firing rockets and hitting and killing Israeli civilians, and we had no choice but to go into Gaza in order to try and eliminate that threat. And this resulted in a United Nations investigation into Israeli war crime headed by Richard Goldstone. And that one ended by the fact that Richard Goldstone, after he had caused enormous damage to Israel by allegations that hit the global media's press, was that he ended up by saying, if I've known then what I know now, maybe I wouldn't have started the investigation in the first place. So here we go again with the special prosecution who we don't know how it's going. We know it's going to start. We know it's going to cause immense PR damage, you want to call it that, to Israel. And whatever happens, Israel will be found obviously innocent of war crime, but it would leave the same sort of stain we had after Goldstone. What's your perception on this?
Well, that's exactly the point, Barry. The initial decision of Bensouda to open an investigation, or to declare that she's opening an investigation into Israel for committing war crimes, has done already tremendous damage to Israel. It has just given justification to the terrorists. It has vilified Israel for invoking its own right of self-defense. It has basically said that Jews are no longer entitled to defend themselves against the homicidal attacks of Hamas and the other terrorists, that the Palestinians have the right almost to murder Jews. That is what Bensouda has said. And really that damage, similar to the Goldstone report, has already been done. Just to see that really, when has to be understood, when Bensouda announced the investigation, it was ostensibly, she tried to play even-handedly and say that the investigation would cover all events in Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip, including potentially war crimes committed by Palestinians. But you had to see, on the other hand, the great joy expressed by the Palestinians, by the terrorist groups, and by the Palestinian Authority, by the great joy expressed just by the decision to open the investigation against Israel. They already understand that whilst Bensouda is trying to pretend to be even-handed, really, she has no intention of investigating the Palestinian terrorists. She has no intention of investigating Hamas terrorism. She has no intention of investigating the PA policy of rewarding terrorists by paying them a monthly salary for and as a reward for committing acts of terrorism, including murdering Israeli civilians. And therefore they can rejoice in the fact that the investigation has been opened against Israel. This gave the same justification and really backwind to all of the NGOs who have been making these false claims all the way along the process. And now they see that they have the opportunity to continue bashing Israel. That unfortunately is damage which no one, I think, at this point can really mitigate to its full extent. That stain of having an international body, even considering the fact that Israel had committed war crimes, was already a stain, but officially opening and announcing an investigation of Israel was damage that really cannot be undone in any way, shape, or form.
Maurice, Israeli Attorney General Avigdor Mandelblit has said that the ICC lacks any jurisdiction into this matter so far as Israel is concerned. And now, just a few days ago, the Israeli government has made a decision that they're not going to cooperate with the ICC. How do you see this going forward? What do you think is going to happen from here on in?
Well, so like we said, Barry, in order to for Fatou Bensouda or the prosecutor, any prosecutor, or for Karim Khan that's going to replace us soon, in order for them to base a real indictment as opposed to the public relations really escapade and propaganda that she's been going down for the last 5 years, there needs to be real, concrete, and credible evidence of Israel committing a crime against humanity. Without Israel's cooperation as part of that investigation, it will be almost, I think, impossible to get to real evidence of the commission of any crime. Again, you have to be able to understand for Operation Protective Edge. It's not sufficient to claim that civilians were killed. It's not sufficient to claim that Israel in some way breached the rules of law. For a prosecution to go forward, they're going to have real evidence. And really, the decision of Israel to say we are not going to cooperate with this farce that's going on. Why does Israel say that the ICC has no jurisdiction? Simply because only states can be members of the ICC. Palestine, as a state, as an independent state, has never existed in history and does not exist today. Even in the decision of the court in response to the request of the prosecutor to Bensouda, said that they're not deciding that a state of Palestine even exists, but merely they're creating the legal fiction that Palestine exists in order to forward the prosecution of Israel. That's an argument which really is shameful. It is a stain on the court, which will, again, like the investigation, it's a stain that the court will not be able to remove for a very long time. It was even the dissenting judge claimed and wrote that the decision of the two majority judges had no basis whatsoever in fact, and even less in law. I think language like that from the president of the pretrial chamber against the two other judges that were sitting as part of the tribunal is very harsh language and really does speak for itself. And so for Bensouda to move forward, she would need that cooperation. And who is she getting the cooperation from? Instead of investigating the Palestinian Authority and the terrorists and the Palestinian terrorists for their war crimes, she is now, again, as Palestinian Media Watch has already exposed time after time, deepening her collusion with the same terrorists who she should be investigating in order to, again, attack Israel. I think that's how it's going to play out. I think putting law aside entirely and any type of reasonable decision of a professional prosecutor, the result is going to be that Israel will be indicted. There will be, I think, requests for arrest of Israeli officials, IDF officials, because we're not talking about law in the ICC. The ICC no longer plays in the field of law. It's no longer a respectable tribunal for dealing with the most heinous of crimes as it was set up to be. Now it's just another part of the lawfare against Israel, where propaganda leads the effort and law is thrown out the window.
Mentioned about potential Israeli soldiers or officers or commanders being actually found guilty. It's unbelievable to say this, but to be not just accused, but probably arrest warrants or whatever as war criminal. This could also apply also to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also to Benny Gantz, who was the IDF commander at that time. But Mandelblit said that he reckoned that there is no jurisdiction ICC has over Israel because Israel has adequately investigated any claims of not just war crime, but any other unlawful or unjustified claims against individual soldiers or units in any battles or behavior. I think this is an aspect that you may know about, and therefore, if Israel has been, again, as a non-member of the International Criminal Court, done adequate and sufficient investigation into unseemly behavior of Israeli soldiers, that also forfeits the right of the ICC to investigate Israel. Am I correct on that?
So yes, Barry, now we're talking about a different subject. Once initial jurisdiction, territorial jurisdiction of the ICC has been established, which here there is a massive case against that territorial jurisdiction, you then have the further question of what's called complementarity. The International Criminal Court is only meant to step in when the national courts are unwilling or unable to deal with claims of their soldiers, of their citizens committing war crimes. Israel has a very, very robust legal system. The judges are completely independent. There are often not a small amount of friction between the judges and the executive branch, the judges and the legislative branch, with the judges really taking for themselves a very dominant position as part of Israel's robust legal system. That system is then obviously ameliorated by the investigative situation where Israel's police or the IDF investigates claims that Israel's civilians or soldiers, whatever the case may be, have committed any type of war crime, any type of crime against humanity, any type of deviation against the law. And those investigations are carried out extensively based on a system that is proven to work time and time again. And Israel has shown that in cases where the evidence showed that Israeli soldiers had committed some type of offense, that Israel then prosecutes those offenders. That is the case. That is clearly the case when it comes to, for example, Operation Protective Edge. There were dozens, scores, maybe hundreds of claims that were made. Many of them were investigated by the procedures set up by Israel, and they were then brought before the military advocate general to decide whether an investigation, a full-on investigation for an alleged crime should be conducted. In some cases, that was the result. In many other cases, you couldn't even show that there was an a priori suspicion that an Israeli soldier had intentionally carried out an offense in order to warrant the opening of a criminal investigation. And that's a process which has been transparent to the world. Bensouda, again, in her decision to move forward, completely and utterly ignores that whole process. She seems to be of the opinion that despite the fact that Israel's system is equivalent to, if not better than, other systems in the world in which she has already decided not to prosecute or not to investigate because of the principle of complementarity, she is nonetheless, again, negating Israel's provisions, negating Israel's system, negating everything that Israel has done. and saying we're nonetheless going to move forward, as if there is nothing that Israel could do that would ever be sufficient. That is the clear conclusion of her actions.
Final question, Maurice, and a complimentary one about this. Have Palestinian courts ever adequately investigated human rights, war crimes, or deviant behavior from any of their own people, whether in the from Gaza or from Ramallah, with regard to the attacks on Israeli civilians, and also using their own people as human shields in aggressive behavior against Israel?
You're asking it, Barry. I think one of the funniest questions ever. It would be like saying or asking, did ISIS ever consider investigating its top commanders that were cutting people's heads off? No, of course they didn't. The Palestinian Authority has never once put on trial, let alone investigate, has never once investigated, and definitely has never put on trial one Palestinian for attacking Israeli civilians. Never. Never. There was one incident at the start of the war in 2000 where a Palestinian policeman who murdered an Israeli soldier who was on a joint patrol with him was put on trial. He was convicted and sentenced to a life imprisonment, but he was then released 2 years later. That is the only case in which the Palestinians have prosecuted other Palestinians for committing crimes against humanity, for attacking Israeli civilians. The whole system supports, promotes, instigates, incites, and rewards Palestinian terrorists. So why would they investigate them? That, of course, Bensouda has ignored, and therefore she is also not going to. But she doesn't care. She doesn't care that she's ignored it because, again, she's not going to investigate them to start out. So we'll never get to the question of complementarity.
Maurice, I want to thank you for giving an absolutely clear position, Israeli position of where we are right now with regard to these ridiculous allegations of potential war crimes investigation against Israel from the International Criminal Court. I want to thank you for your contribution for this. And this is, again, Barry Shaw from The View from Israel on behalf of the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, saying thank you very much. And I hope you'll please share this important video with everybody you know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry.
אנו מכריזים בזאת